Everyone keeps saying the same thing. Inflation is bad. Inflation is the enemy of the people. We must fight inflation. We need to solve this first. Politicians, economists, central bank presidents, and television commentators, everyone repeats the same narrative. Now let's ask ourselves a question, and let's really sit with it for a moment. If inflation is truly as bad, as dangerous, and as destructive as they say, then why does every central bank in the world officially target 2% inflation, not 0%? 2%, which means when you think about it, they do not actually want to eliminate inflation completely. They only want to keep it at a certain level. So why? Why do central banks go into panic mode, call emergency meetings, and inject money into the system whenever inflation falls to zero or enters negative territory? When Japan experienced deflation in the late 1990s, a period where prices were falling, why was it treated not as a victory, but as an economic nightmare that lasted for decades? In every major crisis, whether it was the 2008 global financial crisis or the 2020 pandemic period, governments and central banks immediately printed trillions of dollars. These were not panic decisions made in the heat of the moment. These actions reveal how the system itself works, because up until now, we've been told inflation is an external threat, an enemy, a mistake that got out of control. But what if the opposite is true? What if inflation is not a mistake, but a design? And what if the system actually needs it in order to function? After watching this entire video, I guarantee you will never look at inflation the same way again. And now, let's begin by answering the most fundamental question. What is inflation? Most people say it's rising prices, groceries, gas, and everything becoming more expensive. That's not wrong. It's just incomplete. Let's define inflation properly. Inflation is the systematic decline of purchasing power. The difference between these two definitions is enormous. Why? Because when people say prices are going up, it sounds like goods are becoming more valuable. But in reality, the value of money itself is falling. The piece of paper in your hand simply represents less than it used to. The moment you change your perspective, everything changes. To make this more concrete, in 1970, the average car in America cost around $3,500. Today, a car in the same segment costs at least $35,000 to $40,000. So what caused this difference? Did cars become 10 times more valuable? Did technology improve tenfold? Did steel, rubber, and raw materials become that expensive? None of those explain it. The real value of the car changed far less than people think. What actually happened is that the value of money quietly, almost invisibly, lost around 10 times its purchasing power. And that quietly part is exactly what makes inflation such a powerful tool, because nobody wakes up one morning and says, starting today, my money will lose value. It happens slowly, systematically, continuously. So why do governments want inflation? Let's break it down into three main reasons, and each one may feel more uncomfortable than the last. The first reason, eroding debt. Modern governments operate under massive amounts of debt. The United States has over $34 trillion in debt. Japan's debt exceeds 260% of its entire economy. Major European economies are drowning in debt. China is in debt. Turkey is in debt. India is in debt. Now let's look at a very simple mathematical reality. Imagine a government borrowed $100 million in 1990 and planned to repay it in 2024. The number is the same, $100 million. But is $100 million in 1990 the same as $100 million in 2024? Absolutely not, because inflation over those 34 years drastically reduced the real value and purchasing power of that debt. As money loses value, the real burden of the debt also shrinks. In other words, the government repays its debt with much weaker and much cheaper money. This is not an accident. It is a strategy. A debt-based system does not want strong money. If money remains too valuable, debt becomes too heavy. But if money loses value, debt becomes easier to carry. Governments know this very well. The second reason, showing growth. Gross domestic product, or GDP, measures the economic size of a country, and GDP is fundamentally calculated using the total monetary value of goods and services produced. Now think about this. Suppose prices in an economy rise by 10%. 10%, but real production stays exactly the same. Factories produce the same amount. People work the same amount. What happens? GDP still grows because the same products are now being sold at higher prices. So when politicians go on television and say, our economy achieved strong growth this year, what may actually be happening is this: money lost value, prices inflated, the numbers simply looked bigger. Is that a deception? Not exactly. But it is not exactly the full truth either. The third reason, keeping the system moving. In an inflationary environment, the money you hold loses value over time. This simple reality fundamentally changes human behavior. If you wait, you lose. So what do people do? They spend, they invest, they borrow, they participate in production. As a result, money keeps moving. The economy stays active. The system keeps functioning. But now think about deflation, an environment where prices are falling. Your money becomes more valuable every single day. So what do? You wait. You think it'll be cheaper tomorrow. Everyone waits. Spending slows down. Investments stop. Unemployment rises. And the system stalls. That is exactly what happened in Japan. And it is also what happened during the Great Depression of the 1930s. Now you understand why zero inflation is viewed as a terrifying scenario by governments and central banks. So where does inflation actually come from? And how is it created? The answer is money supply. When the amount of money circulating in an economy increases, while the amount of goods and services stays the same, prices rise. It's a very simple equation. More money competing for the same amount of goods means each good is sold for more money. Now, during the 2008 crisis, which I explained in detail in another video on this channel, the world watched major banks collapse, the mortgage market implode, and the global financial system nearly freeze completely. What was the first thing central banks did? They printed trillions of dollars. They called it quantitative easing. It sounds extremely technical, but in simple terms, it means we injected newly created money into the system, money created out of nothing. And when we arrived in 2020, the pandemic brought the entire world to a standstill. Planes were grounded, factories shut down, people were trapped in their homes. The global economy almost stopped functioning. So what happened? The United States alone injected around $6 trillion of new money into the economy. Europe, Japan, and the United Kingdom took similar actions. Banks were rescued again. Corporations received support again. And then what happened? In 2021 and 2022, the world experienced one of the strongest inflation waves in modern history. Was that really a surprise? Absolutely not. Trillions of newly created dollars entered the system before supply chains and production had recovered, and prices exploded. The reason is simple. New money reduced the value of existing money. There are no exceptions to this principle. It always applies. And now let's face the reality that governments, central banks, and economists understand very well. If this cycle of money creation stops, if inflation completely disappears, the system itself begins to break down. Now we arrive at the most important question. Who actually wins in an inflationary system, and who loses? Unfortunately, the answer is uncomfortable. The winners, debtors. If you have fixed debt while inflation continues, the real value of your debt decreases every year. Numerically, the debt remains the same, but as purchasing power changes, the burden becomes lighter. And the biggest debtors, the biggest winners of inflation, are governments, large corporations, major investors. The other winners, asset owners. During inflationary periods, housing prices usually rise because a house is a real asset, not cash. As money loses value, real assets tend to appreciate. Stock owners experience similar protection. Gold, commodities, land. These are all assets that naturally defend themselves against inflation. Real assets often rise in value even faster. And the losers? Salaried workers. Let's do a very simple calculation. Suppose your salary increased by 5% this year, but inflation was 10%. In real terms, you became 5% poorer. But nobody tells you that. Instead, they say, you got a raise. Be grateful. And this is where we see the most painful part of the system. Do you own factories, real estate, stocks? If yes, inflation may not destroy you. In fact, it may increase your wealth. But if all you have is a salary, you fall further behind every single year. Slowly, silently, systematically. This is not an accident. This inequality is deeply built into the system itself. Now let's step back and look at the bigger picture. Why does inflation exist? Because governments carry debts too large to repay honestly. Because economic growth numbers are expected to look bigger. Because people are expected to spend, invest, and participate in the system. Because money is expected to keep moving constantly. Inflation is not an accident. Inflation is a design. And this design is not primarily built for the public. What I can say clearly is this: inflation keeps the system alive. But now I want to leave you with one final question. Where does all this money actually come from? How do banks inject this money into the system? And what happens to your money during this process? In the video, How Money is Created Out of Thin Air, I explained exactly that. Because once you understand how money is created out of nothing, you begin to understand inflation much more clearly. To understand why inflation is necessary, you first need to understand how money itself is created. See you in the next video.